That's nothing. It's that air goes into your lungs and is heated and then is returned to the colder air of the room, and what you're seeing is the mixing of warm and cold air, which have different refractive indices, and so it shows up as a kind of wave-like distortion. Could be. I'm a reductionist on one level. If it's not real, I want to know that it's not real. But I'm not sure that that's what it is, because it seems to me they are beginning on a very small level to do this thing. And language seems to me to be a continuous spectrum. And because I'm a public speaker, because I work with language, I think about these things a fair bit. It seems to me language begins in total inarticulation. I mean, basically, kind of stuff. And then it moves on to operational speech. Give me this, bring me that, change my diapers, this kind of thing. And then you introduce the notion of communication. I mean, at what age do children become capable of saying, I feel X, Y, and Z? What this means is they are beginning to move invisible interior modalities out into the linguistic domain. Say, I feel sick at my stomach. I feel too awake to go to bed. So on. Well, then you get more complex ideas where people are conveying abstract ideas. And then you get eloquence, a speaker who can make you listen and who can rivet your attention. Well, then beyond eloquence comes poetry. And supposedly in the Irish tradition and in other traditions, great poetic feats were undertaken, and poets were magicians. The difference between a poet and a magician was practically nil. And that's where we're asked to believe that it ends, in great poetic eloquence. But it seems to me it's possible to just keep going. And one of the curious things about the way we think about language is when we talk about clear language, we always use visual metaphors. To understand someone, if you understand someone, you say, I see what you mean. I see what you mean. Seeing is the sense that we trust. And someone says, he spoke clearly. Visual metaphor. She painted a picture. I see what you mean. As though we unconsciously sense that language is an uncompleted project at this point, moving toward a visual mode of expression. And I think if we say the psychedelics are catalysts on imagination, then what is it that they are catalyzing? They are catalyzing the further concrescence of language. And who knows how long this is? Looking back at the invention of language, you kind of have to suspect that it happened rather suddenly, that people went from not speaking to speaking quite suddenly. They had all the machinery, the physical machinery, the lungs, the vocal cord, the coordinating mind, and apparently, if you follow Chomsky and his school, the genetically laid down foundations for syntax. And syntax, Chomsky has shown, precedes language. I mean, chimpanzees and squids show evidence of syntax, but their language is extremely rudimentary. Somehow you can't have language until you have syntax. Syntax are the rules which define language. But then, at a certain point, language has this capacity to become truly self-reflecting. I can't imagine what a world would be like where this ability was mastered. I suppose you would have to say it was a psychedelic world. Yeah.
Earlier you were talking about this possibility, and you started mentioning, I can't imagine how you could do this, and you started talking about it, and to me it felt you were talking about something hovering. And at that point, you could almost see that it would be possible to continue when you said hovering, I got hovering. I could almost see something hovering. And so it seems like there's really an evolutionary thing, as you were mentioning, that once people get used to really hearing each other, that it'll just begin to happen, that little by little we'll get used to it. We may not even know it, and maybe it's happening now, that language is being used much more in different ways than it used to be.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, my fantasy is of a workshop where someday we get it out. I mean, that's really what I want to do, is I want to punch a hole into the other place and have this linguistical, syntactical, intentionality-directed stuff pour into this universe and fill it to the brim. It seems to me that this is a real possibility. Whenever I'm stoned, I have this notion of, I call it the last conversation. It's where it seems possible to sit down with somebody of goodwill and say, we're going to have the last conversation. We're going to start from here, and we're going to work our way in, and when it's over with, there will be no you, there will be no me, there will be no here, there will be no there, because we will have carried out some kind of Derrida-type deconstruction project on the apparent reality, and we'll be left with bedrock. I think this, I don't know if that's the same program as the visible language. What I do know is that on ayahuasca in the Amazon basin, this is what's going on. They call it singing, but it's a visual art. And, you know, some of you, our little company sells ayahuasca songs. Well, they are audio recordings, but they are visual works of art. How they sound doesn't matter. It's how they look. And when you're sitting in a blackened hut with these people, you'll hear someone lay down a riff which manifests as a fluorescent pink line with gray undershading. And then the shaman sitting, and it's a wavy line, and the shaman sitting next to the singer will then go back through and place a mirrored green dot in the trough of each wave. And the sound is lost in this. The experience is entirely visual. Well, is it only abstract colored patterns and moving fields of light? Or could I sing you my grandfather, and you would see him with his blue visor and his pegged pants and his crew cut? It's this kind of thing, you know. This is why I believe the psychedelic experience has some kind of historical role to play. If we take seriously the idea that it's an enzyme for the imagination, and if we take seriously the notion that language is the carrier wave of the imagination, then probably what we're involved in here is a quantized evolutionary leap to a higher modality of language. And it will come out of our biological organization, see? It's not cultural, and it's still less technological. It's in the bones and tongue and brain and lungs of human beings. Yeah.
Terence, when you're in one of these circumstances and you speak to the little people, if someone were in the room with you, would they hear you speak?
Oh, yeah.
Well, so you actually acoustically verbalize this conversation from your side.
Yes, it's a kind of glossolalia, or that's what we would have to call it. Glossolalia, as you all probably know, is speaking in tongues, but this has characteristics that glossolalia doesn't have. For one thing, people who do glossolalia have a kind of disconnectedness from it. In other words, in these Pentecostal churches, when someone will go into glossolalia, often when they come out, they will turn to the people around them and say, did I speak in tongues? Did I really do it? In other words, there seems to be a kind of occlusion of the observing mind. The other thing is glossolalia of that sort involves pretty radical physiological changes. Some of you may know Felicitas Goodman, who wrote a book on glossolalia. She measured pools of saliva 18 inches across, having originated from a single person during a 20-minute burst of glossolalia. Well, that's a pretty lathered up, hyped up state to be in. The glossolalia induced by DMT and psilocybin is controlled and willed. It's as though the language forming, the English forming part of the mind steps away, and an Ursprach, a kind of primordial language, steps in, and it's highly modulated. It doesn't have to be screamed, sung, or chanted. It can simply be done at conversational levels. Now, when you do this in the stoned state, it's wonderful. And when you make tape recordings of it and listen to it in the unstoned state, it's either alarming or silly. I mean, people have said to me, soft pedal this part of it because it's too weird.
The place I was trying to get to is that in order to form these sounds, there is some sort of, presumably, if you use today's electronic model, some sort of electronic neurological something going on in the synapses that cause the muscles to form the sounds.
Right.
Well, that's a radiation of electrical energy that starts the mechanical, acoustical coupling to the vocal cords. And in trying to figure out, you were discussing earlier the mechanism. How would you make this work? And then would you actually see the sound coming out of the throat? It would seem to me more reasonable to pick the electronic model and the radiation of electromagnetic energy rather than acoustical to project this information.
True, although it is interesting that sound can be used to form holograms, which are three-dimensional objects. In other words, there are what are known as acoustical holograms, not generated by lasers, but generated by patterns of interference that are acoustic waves. So it took me for years in these psychedelic states. I could hear this translinguistic stuff, but never do it. Then I became able to do it on the drugs, and then after many more years, I've become able to do it pretty much on the natch, or at least give a reasonable imitation of it. But when I do it and I'm not stoned, it doesn't transport me, but it has syntax, it has order. I'll give you a short sample of this so you can see, and then we'll go to lunch. If I can do it. If I'm at all self-conscious or anxious, something shuts down and I can't, and I know I'm faking it and it's not real. He waxi kai midi ke pichikt pipin. It teftiem waxi ke pipit. Ed dejeveng wow angak dead ordivi inkepekektetan. It's like that.
It's a beautiful song.
It sounds to me, it's far removed from English. It sounds to me like a very primitive language. The image that comes to my mind is of pygmies around a fire. One guy raving. He's telling a story. Ed dejive mengo quai paktiket. Eftonque etece mystike fidig. There's something in there. It feels like meaning, but it doesn't compute to a dictionary. But when you do it on your own, you just can do it for hours in that state, and it's very, very satisfying. What you're hearing is the shadow thrown by a hyperdimensional object that the person making the sound is actually seeing. I mean, they're rotating this thing, looking at it, going into it, expanding it, taking it apart, melting it, fusing it, remaking it. Strange stuff. I've played this stuff for linguists, this very straight linguist. I played about a 30-minute burst of it, and he smoked his pipe through it all. And when it was over, he said, no O's. Did you want to say something?
Did you just make that up? I mean,
did I just make that up?
I mean, that's not like something you memorized, or that's not.
No, I just made that up.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you have any images? What was going on? Can you describe what was going on inside of you when you were doing that?
I was trying to stand aside. I was trying to not do anything to it. I was just trying to let it be. Because, there'll be a part of it and I'll think as it goes by, sounds French. Or the main effort is to just relax and let it be. The way I discovered it was when I smoke DMT, I can't stop myself. And at first I would yell it. And, that got me, my friends were concerned. And so slowly I've been able to bring it down into this conversational level. But it just goes on, and has a feeling, has a tone, very satisfying to do. That's why I think I said on Friday night, I had this in mind. I think language existed for millennia before meaning. Meaning, bull, bison, reindeer. Meaning is just some kind of late thing that was tacked on to language to make it a more practical enterprise. But I think people were taking drugs and amusing each other with artistic compositions of the sort I just did for you for a long, long time before they did anything practical with it.
Terence, have you? I was just wondering if you thought that language may have changed around the time that agriculture came in, when things were, all the diversities were narrowed down to a few commodities. And if that's any...
Well, I think language goes through tremendous periods of impoverishment, and that was one. The origin point of language is placed at about 35,000, although on what basis they do this, I'm not sure. There is a flute in existence that's 26,000 years old. That's pretty interesting. And that's not the Museum of Atlantis artifacts either. That's the real thing. The Pythagorean faith that number, musical tone, language, proportion, it's still alive. I mean, there's still something to be learned there. A perfect science, an appropriate science, a science of harmony, resonance, proportion. That is and remains, I think, the shamanic ideal, the Orphic ideal, the Pythagorean ideal. Well, let's break for lunch and let's come back around to 2 or a little after.
We have a couple of opportunities to ask some questions.
Yeah, we'll do that. Why don't we pull together here? And basically, we seem to be going pretty strong at lunchtime. So why don't we just pick up where we left off? If anybody still has unresolved things they want to say or questions that occurred to them through lunch.
About the MAO inhibitors and the certain amino acids, I heard if you have any kind of MAO inhibitor in your system, it's dangerous or something.
Well, I'm not sure what that refers to. You do not want to take certain hallucinogens if you're taking an MAO inhibitor because it will make it prolong it and cause it to behave in unpredictable ways. Now, there are many MAO inhibitors commercially prescribed, some quite strong. I mean, in other words, that act for weeks I think even after a single dosage. What are those things for?
The common scenario is Marplan, which is a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. And what that means is that's the enzyme. Monoamine oxidase is the enzyme that destroys monoamines. So if you are taking that particular drug, and then you take something that builds up in your system, like aged cheeses or
lentils.
I think even mushrooms may be part of it. It's aged cheeses, wines, fermented kinds of things that have lots of amphetamine type of chemicals in them. There's a overload at the synapse when this happens because it can't break it down, and your brain basically, deteriorates. And there are a lot of, well, not a lot, but there was at one time before they knew of this, where people did this and died. So apparently the hallucinogen has some of that buildup, and it can't be destroyed properly, so that's why there's the warning not to take it.
So the hallucinogen is a monoamine, and then if you inhibit the monoamine oxidase, which is the compound which oxidizes the monoamine, then the monoamine will accumulate. Now, it's important to know this because we tend to move in a yuppie environment, and a typical yuppie buffet of good burgundies and good brie is just going to load your system with tyramine, tyrosine, these kinds of things, and they are monoamine oxidase inhibitors. Well, then if you 12 hours or 24 hours later take a hit of ayahuasca or something, why, it's just going to send you skittering all over the board, and you won't understand why unless you are aware that this monoamine thing is working.
The idea of the precursors of certain neurochemicals. Like I heard the ayahuasca diet, specifically Luna gave a talk once in New York about it. He said it was like smoked fish and plantain. Mm-hmm. And possibly this is the precursors of certain neurotransmitters.
Yeah, this is a more complicated question than simply yes or no on a monoamine oxidase inhibitors. Serotonin, which is, of course, the neurotransmitter that runs the nervous systems of all higher animals and occurs in all animals, is very strongly present in bananas, for example. So you can load your system with serotonin without realizing it if you eat a lot of bananas. In fact, it was very interesting. There was a group of people in tribal Africa who had actually lost the gene for the production of serotonin, or of serotonin B in any case, one subspecies of serotonin. And they didn't know that that was what was wrong with them. All they knew was that whenever anybody left the tribe, they would become psychologically ill and go mad. And then when they would return to the tribe, this situation would immediately normalize. Well, so then they looked into it and they discovered that these people were eating bananas as a huge component of their diet. Consequently, even though the serotonin gene was deficient, they were always had a sufficient amount of serotonin because they were getting it from a dietary source. But if somebody left the tribe and left the forest and went to Kampala or something and got a job and stopped eating so many bananas, they immediately appeared to become mentally ill. This is because they were then finally forced to confront the fact that on the natch they could not produce enough serotonin to stay balanced. So this is an example of how foods and neurotransmitters and all these things work. It's really astonishing, the fact that evolutionary biologists, in talking about how human beings have come to be, have never, so far as I know, talked about the evolutionary influence of diet. You see, the fact that under pressure from dwindling rainforests, we ceased being fruitarian canopy-living creatures, and instead became omnivores and meat-eaters on the plain, in going through that transition, we subjected ourselves to a huge amount of mutagenic influence. There are all kinds of compounds in plants that will break chromosomes, interfere with ovulation, interfere with lactation, interfere with fetal formation, control or accelerate tooth decay, interfere with acuity of vision, digestive enzymes that may or may not work in certain situations, so that if you start just eating things randomly or testing things to be foods, you're exposing yourself and your progeny to an immense number of mutagenic influences. This may explain why the human somotype, the human body type, went through this period of rapid change about 50,000 years ago. This is when the brain size doubled. And then nothing much has happened since, physically, to human beings. All evolution has gone on in the cultural domain. But this sudden explosion in the size of the brain case is occurring at the same time when there is this dietary shift. And one of the things I mentioned the other night is the preservation of infantile characteristics as part of our species, not necessarily simply infantilism psychologically, but also, for instance, our hairlessness. Most primate babies are born hairless, but we're the ones who stay hairless the whole time. The suppression of secondary sexual characteristics. For instance, our rumps don't redden when we're in estrus, and all these things that we see happening in other primate species are suppressed in human beings. So, and there's a lot of debate about why these things go on. Why, for instance, there isn't a mating season in human beings, or why it is that female human beings can keep pregnancy a secret for quite a long time before it becomes apparent. How does this feed back in then to primate social organization? What do males do if they think a female is pregnant or not pregnant? And how does this work into the evolutionary thing? So there's a lot of thought that needs to be given to all of this, and MAO and how it works is one of the most easily influenced of these internal enzyme systems, because there are MAO inhibitors in so many things that are human foods: pulses, all beans, fish, cheeses, dairy products, so forth and so on. The very things that were probably fairly prominent in the primitive diet.
Psilocybins?
Yes, it also, all monoamines will be more active in a human being who has taken a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. Now, one of the strange things, and I mentioned this yesterday, is that in the Amazon they have figured out how to make this work for them. Certain DMT, for instance, cannot be taken orally. It's destroyed in your gut. But if you inhibit MAO, then it isn't destroyed in the gut, passes through to the bloodstream and through the blood-brain barrier. They figured this out. It's only been since the mid-50s or something that the monoamine oxidase system has been understood by Western medicine. These people apparently intuitively figured it out thousands and thousands of years ago. Yeah.
I have a chemical question, but I can't help but interject that a little promo for the rind of citrus and the pulp of citrus, which contains the bioflavonoids with ascorbic acid, because that's exactly what happened to Homo sapiens during its Fruitarian era, when we ate so much naturally occurring vitamin C in the fruits that our enzyme systems just said, well, why synthesize ascorbic acid in the liver? We have this so much abundance of ascorbic acid in the fruits. So we lost the enzyme to convert sugar, glucose, into ascorbic acid. And Linus Pauling based his whole quote-unquote vitamin C theory on every animal that still is synthesizing, like goats synthesize 10 grams of ascorbic acid per day, pigs 5 grams, and so that's how he worked it out that we need about 2 to 3 grams of not vitamin C ascorbic acid, but the vitamin C complex, which contains asparagine and rutin and bioflavonoids. And when you put, since I've done that and put those together, I have never had a cold. The misunderstanding in the culture is people go to Safeway and they buy 500 milligrams of ascorbic acid USP, and it doesn't work because it doesn't have the other synergistic parts of the team, just like in the mushrooms, all these little extra fairies or parts that make the thing work. So that banana...
Yeah, that's a similar story.
That's the story. That's why, when they left the tribe, the body just said, well, we don't need to make this kind of, synthesize this kind of serotonin. It's in the bananas. Why waste that energy?
I had heard, like, if you, the day before that you do medicine, if you take a lot of ripe bananas, it could make the trip a lot more gentle.
Well, it probably, you see, these things compete with serotonin for the bond site. They are, in fact, inhibitors of serotonin, many of them. And I don't know if it makes it gentler or if maybe you have a huge amount of serotonin in your system. The serotonin can actually mitigate the trip. It's a gentler trip because it's not as strong a trip as it would be had you not loaded yourself with serotonin.
Some people do. I mean, that's the whole theory of why people get depressed. So certain people have higher levels of serotonin and certain people have lower, and if you got higher levels, supposedly it correlates with how naturally high you are and why some people get depressed.
Yeah, although it's been sort of hard to nail this down. When they first started doing psychedelic research, they thought that it was the so-called psychotomimetic theory of psychedelics, that these things make you crazy, therefore being crazy must be a natural state of producing these things. And so, for instance, they measure DMT in the blood of people who are diagnosed chronic schizophrenic. The problem is there's no visible correlation. Some people have more, some people have less. It isn't as simple as that mad people are people who are making their own psychedelic molecules. There was great hope for this in the 50s, but it didn't quite pan out. A thing to bear in mind, sort of related to what you were saying, is disease, which we accept as part of life, is actually something fairly unusual in nature. The only places in nature where you see a lot of disease happening is in insects. Insects are highly subject to viruses, and there's a huge family of insect viruses. This is the basis of many pesticide design strategies, is to spray crops with viruses that attack insects. The other area in the animal world where you see a lot of disease is human beings and the animals they have domesticated, so that cattle, pigs, poultry, and people are all fairly subject to disease. But for instance, birds of prey are not greatly subject to disease. Many fewer diseases. Fish, all animal groups have some susceptibility to diseases, but really human beings and insects seem to be the most set up for this. And the reason that is advanced for this is that these are the social animals, the insects and the human beings. And wherever you have intense social activity, for instance, in some species, a male and a female will encounter each other only once in the life of each individual, then have sex, and that's it. There is no social life. Well, so that's no disease can get a foothold there, because diseases require transmission and contact. The AIDS thing is a perfect example of this. I mean, the statistics are that a professional prostitute has perhaps 5 or 6 sexual contacts in an evening. A person at high risk for AIDS with a very active homosexual lifestyle may have 3 or 4 times that number of sexual contacts. Well, no virus is going to pass a chance like that up. I mean, it's just like a super intense environment for transmission. The diseases want to be able to move from one person to another. The reason I mention this is because the rise of this susceptibility to disease is something that apparently also was going on at the same time that we were acquiring language, beginning to domesticate animals, switching our diet. What we really are the evolutionary wreckage of a very chaotic and crazy series of pattern shifts that went on between 50 and 100,000 years ago. Now we are the inheritors of that. Very interesting, as long as I'm on this subject, very interesting relationship between disease and spirituality, because pilgrimage sites are the great disease vectors of the ancient world. I mean, you can imagine, here you have a temple, everybody comes there to get cured, and everybody comes there and leaves sick, because all these infected people have been there. There's a wonderful book, I can't remember the author, but the title is Plagues and Peoples, and it's a study of epidemiology and the history of disease and its impact on human populations. And very interesting, and has a lot to say, I think, about psychedelic use as well, by implication, because psychedelic use also brings people together under very close and intimate circumstances many times.
Let me ask my question.
Sure.
Please. This is a chemical question in terms of, I have never done these substances that you're talking about. Specifically, I mean the NN dimethyltryptamine and the 5-MO dimethyltryptamine. And what you're talking about is ayahuasca, which is a hybrid of an MAO inhibitor and DMT, correct? And those are the chemical names of these substances. Are there generic names or so-called street names for these things that you are aware of? That's the first part of the question. And secondly, since those are pure chemicals, unlike mushrooms, which contain maybe 3 or 4 different synergistic psychedelics, the possibility in my chemical mind was, 5-hydroxytryptamine is 5-hydroxytryptamine, and what is the scenario for synthesizing it?
Well, I'm not sure I have it all. First of all, 5-MeO DMT doesn't occur in ayahuasca. The synergy, the way ayahuasca works, the MAO inhibitor is a beta-carboline, harmine, harmaline, tetrahydroharman. Now, these things are hallucinogens in their own right, but only at uncomfortable doses. I mean, if you took 600 milligrams of harmine, you would have hallucinations, but you would also have so much discomfort and icky feeling that you couldn't call it a trip. 5-MeO occurs in Anodonanthera peregrina and in the toad foam that I mentioned. It's interesting that the toad foam is the only animal-based hallucinogen that we know anything about. There are DMT does occur in certain fish, and these fish are eaten for psychedelic effect. The DMT is psychedelic in its own right, but not when taken orally. But when taken with the harmine, it becomes orally active. You only have to take, if you combine 200 milligrams of harmine, which is a subthreshold dose of harmine, with 50 milligrams of DMT, which is a subthreshold dose of DMT, you'll have a tremendous trip.
And that's called ayahuasca.
That's called ayahuasca. But it comes from these plant sources.
And you
drink it. It's a beverage. It's a fluid. Tastes terrible. Yeah.
I wanted to ask one question about set and setting. You were saying, I think what you were saying, what I heard you say, I just want to see if this is what you were saying, is that your sort of recommendation would be to do a committed dose, like say 5 milligrams.
5 grams of mushroom.
5 grams, 5 grams. Or mushrooms in a kind of silent space, preferably at nighttime, and also alone.
If that's your predilection, if you're comfortable with that, if you're uncomfortable with that, get a friend. Is that your question?
I guess that's my question, because it seems to me, like from reading Stan Grof's books, the point that he makes is that these substances are basically physiologically very safe. The danger is in psychological acting out, and it's for that reason that you have a sitter, in order to prevent a kind of confusion of what he calls holotropic and hylotropic, i.e. you decide you can fly, so you jump off your balcony, because you're confusing your psychic reality, which is that you can fly, with the physical reality of your body, which will fall off the balcony and hit the ground.
Well, if you had that delusion, you would certainly want a sitter present. In 99% of the cases, what the sitter is there for is not to restrain you, but to tell you that it's okay. Just to say that it's okay. This is immensely reassuring to people, no matter how uncertain the sitter is, that it is okay. I mean, you could almost have a button which you push which says, "You're okay. Don't worry. It won't last forever." Something like that. I guess I'm sort of in a funny position on the sitter issue, because I find them so distracting. But you do want it. The one time you need them, you really need them. The other thing is this issue of should you do it indoors or outdoors. Well, what I found is that I really like keeping it mental. I like keeping everything. That's my way of controlling the situation. And if you go out into the world, we all know this phenomenon called synchronicity, which is where it's weird for no reason, Well, if you go out into the world, you will just stoned, you will just discover that it is a maelstrom of synchronicity. And I don't like being swept away into strange and unexpected adventures. I remember, this is an example of how this works. I was at Sarnath once, outside of Benares. Sarnath is the place where Buddha preached his first sermon after attaining enlightenment. He was enlightened at Bodh Gaya. Then he walked south many, many miles to the deer park at Sarnath and gave his first sermon there. And there's a stupa there, an ancient stupa, 2nd century BC. And manicured green parks, and very nice place to take a psychedelic, I thought. So I took this psychedelic. It happened to be mescaline, with these 2 women who were friends of mine, and nobody could be seen, just nobody around. It was very early in the morning. We were sitting up on this little knoll under a tree, and it began to come on strongly. And I was looking out over this green expanse, and almost at the edge of discernible vision, I suddenly see two people, two dots, two people moving orthogonal to my position, moving across my field of vision.